Listen, sweetheart. The cleaning crew enters through the back. The words hung in the air like toxic smoke, but they weren't the opening shot of this story. They were the final nail in the coffin of Derek Hoffman's career, though he didn't know it yet. To understand the earthquake that was about to tear through Skybridge Airlines, we need to rewind 3 hours earlier to when the storm first arrived at JFK International Airport. The rain hammered against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Terminal 4 with the relentless fury of nature unleashed, each droplet exploding against the glass like tiny bombs that turned the outside world into a gray, distorted nightmare. Inside the terminal, the atmosphere was thick with the kind of tension that comes when hundreds of travelers find themselves trapped between where they were and where they desperately needed to be. Their plans shattered by forces beyond their control. The air conditioning hummed with corporate efficiency, pumping out sterile, recycled air that carried the faint smell of cleaning chemicals and the unmistakable anxiety of delayed passengers. But underneath it all lurked something else entirely: the electric charge that precedes a revolution. Simone Reynolds stood in the middle of this chaos, but she wasn't just another stranded passenger. She was a woman who had spent the last 3 weeks in Tanzania overseeing the construction of water treatment facilities that would provide clean drinking water to over 50,000 people, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you've changed lives, while others were arguing about quarterly profits. Her father had been the first black airline pilot at what was then called American Airways back in 1967, and he'd faced discrimination that would have broken lesser men enduring racial slurs from passengers who couldn't believe a black man was qualified to fly their plane safely through the sky. He'd taught her that dignity was never negotiable, that respect wasn't something you begged for, but something you commanded through excellence, and that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice wasn't anger, but the devastating calm of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were worth. She wore an oversized beige cashmere hoodie that looked like something you might grab off a rack at a discount store, but anyone who understood fabric would recognize the distinct weave of Brunello Cucinelli's finest work, a garment that cost more than most people's monthly rent, yet somehow managed to look effortlessly casual. Her sneakers were scuffed from walking through construction sites in rural Africa, and her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that spoke to 3 weeks of prioritizing clean water over personal grooming. But there was something in her posture that commanded attention even when she was trying to blend in. The vintage Hermes duffel bag she carried looked beaten and weathered from years of international travel, its leather softened by countless journeys to places where boardrooms and balance sheets mattered far less than human dignity and basic survival. But it was a gift from her father before his death, and she'd carried it to every continent as a reminder of where she came from and why her work mattered. What none of the harried passengers rushing past her knew, what none of the gate agents typing furiously on their computers could have imagined, was that Simone Reynolds had just completed the acquisition of Skybridge Airlines exactly 2 hours and 17 minutes ago, while cruising at 40,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean. The digital signatures had been exchanged, the wire transfers completed, and the Securities and Exchange Commission paperwork filed, all while she sat in her private jet reviewing the personnel files of every manager, every executive, and every board member, who would soon discover that their comfortable world of casual cruelty and institutional negligence had just been purchased by someone who understood the difference between power and authority. Reynolds Global, her multinational conglomerate that specialized in everything from renewable energy to pharmaceutical development to emergency humanitarian aid, now owned every plane, every hangar, every coffee machine, and every executive contract in the Skybridge Airlines empire. But Simone hadn't rushed to announce her ownership, hadn't called a press conference or sent out the typical corporate communications about new management and strategic direction. Instead, she'd made a choice that would define everything that followed. She wanted to see the operation raw, to witness how her new employees treated people when they thought the boss wasn't watching, to understand exactly what kind of culture she'd inherited before she decided whether to reform it or burn it down completely. She understood that companies like people revealed their true character, not in moments of scrutiny, but in moments of assumed privacy, when they believed no one important was paying attention to how they wielded whatever small measure of power they'd been given. The terminal felt like a battlefield where the war hadn't started yet, but everyone could sense the approaching conflict in the way conversations died when certain people walked by, in the way gate agents straightened their shoulders when they spotted uniforms that meant authority, in the way passengers clutched their boarding passes like talismans against the arbitrary cruelty of airline bureaucracy. Delayed flights created a pressure cooker environment where everyone's worst instincts bubbled closer to the surface, where customer service representatives who might normally fake politeness allowed their true feelings about the traveling public to seep through the cracks of their professional facades. It was the perfect storm, literally and figuratively, for revealing who people really were when they thought they could get away with showing their authentic selves. Simone had built her fortune by understanding systems, by recognizing patterns that others missed, and by having the patience to watch and analyze before taking action. She'd learned to read the invisible hierarchies that existed in every organization, the unspoken rules about who mattered and who didn't, the casual cruelties that were dismissed as just business or industry standard practice, but were actually choices made by individuals who decided that some people deserved respect and others didn't. She'd seen it in corporate boardrooms, where she was the only black face, and colleagues assumed she was someone's assistant rather than the person who'd built the company that was acquiring theirs. She'd experienced it in international negotiations where powerful men spoke to her male assistants instead of addressing her directly, as if her authority was somehow negotiable rather than absolute. But those experiences hadn't made her bitter or paranoid. They'd made her strategically intelligent about how power really worked and how it could be wielded most effectively. She knew that the most devastating response to institutional disrespect wasn't dramatic confrontation, but the kind of quiet competence that revealed other people's inadequacy by contrast. She'd learned to let people underestimate her, to allow them to reveal their assumptions and prejudices, and then to respond not with anger, but with the kind of calm demonstration of capability that left no room for doubt about who was actually in control of any given situation. The storm outside wasn't just weather. It was an omen of the tempest about to be unleashed inside Terminal 4, where a woman who'd spent her morning authorizing humanitarian aid to drought-stricken regions of East Africa was about to encounter the kind of everyday racism that thrived in spaces where people assumed they'd never be held accountable for their casual cruelty. The Skybridge Airline's prestige counter stood like a monument to artificial exclusivity, surrounded by red velvet ropes that created the illusion of significance, while actual significance walked unrecognized through every airport terminal in America every single day. Behind that counter, Angela Martinez was engaged in the kind of aggressive phone scrolling that had become the universal signal for "I'm too busy with my personal drama to acknowledge your existence." Her manicured nails clicking against the screen as she navigated through social media with the focused intensity of someone who'd convinced herself that other people's lives on Instagram were more important than the actual human beings standing in front of her. Angela had been working the prestige counter for 3 years, and she'd developed the particular brand of disdain that comes when someone who earns $43,000 a year is given the authority to make much wealthier people wait for her attention. A tiny taste of power that she wielded like a weapon against anyone who didn't immediately signal their membership in the exclusive club of people she'd been trained to recognize as important. She wore her uniform like armor, the crisp blue blazer and silk scarf arrangement that was supposed to convey professionalism, but had instead become a costume that allowed her to perform superiority over passengers who didn't meet her visual checklist of wealth status and what she'd been conditioned to recognize as belonging. When Simone approached the counter, Angela's peripheral vision registered movement, but she didn't look up from her phone where she was commenting on a friend's vacation photos with the kind of enthusiasm she never showed actual customers. The absence of acknowledgement wasn't accidental. It was a calculated demonstration of her authority to ignore people who didn't immediately strike her as worthy of her professional attention, a power play that she'd learned from watching Derek Hoffman treat certain passengers like inconveniences rather than human beings paying for a service. "Excuse me, Simone," said her voice carrying the raspy exhaustion of someone who'd just spent 20 hours traveling from Tanzania to New York, but also the unmistakable quality of someone accustomed to being heard the first time she spoke. She rested her weathered duffel bag on the counter, the leather showing the honest wear of someone who traveled to places where appearance mattered less than results, where the quality of your work spoke louder than the price of your accessories. Angela finally deigned to glance up, but it was the kind of look that suggested she was doing Simone a tremendous favor by briefly pausing her more important activities to acknowledge her presence. Her eyes performed a quick scan that had become automatic after years of customer service training. That was really discrimination training disguised as efficiency protocols. Taking in Simone's hoodie, her casual sneakers, her lack of obvious luxury brand displays, her natural hair pulled back in a practical ponytail rather than styled for show. Angela's lip curled in what she probably thought was too subtle to notice, but Simone had seen that exact expression 1,000 times before in 1,000 different places. The universal signal of someone who decided you didn't belong based on a 5-second visual assessment. "Economy check-in is down the hall to the left," Angela said, without any attempt at pleasantness, her voice carrying the tone people use when they're explaining something obvious to someone they consider intellectually inferior. She gestured vaguely toward the signs that directed lower-class passengers away from the sacred space of the prestige counter, then immediately returned her attention to her phone, as if the conversation was already over, and Simone should be grateful for the brief guidance about where people like her were supposed to go. "I'm not flying economy," Simone replied, her voice maintaining the calm professionalism she'd learned in boardrooms, where raising her voice would have been immediately labeled as aggressive or emotional, where she'd had to master the art of commanding respect without giving anyone an excuse to dismiss her as an angry black woman. "I have a meeting in the lounge and I need to check the status of a flight." Now Angela did look up, really look up, and her expression shifted into something that was supposed to pass for customer service but was actually a performance of barely controlled irritation at having her initial assessment challenged. Her eyes performed another scan, this time more deliberate and judgmental, taking in every detail of Simone's appearance with the kind of scrutiny that was never applied to white passengers in expensive suits, the kind of examination that was looking for reasons to deny service rather than ways to provide it. "Ma'am," Angela said, loading that single word with enough condescension to fill a small aircraft, her voice dripping with the artificial sweetness that customer service representatives use when they want to be rude while maintaining plausible deniability about their rudeness. "The Prestige Lounge is for Gold Star members and first-class ticket holders only. We have a very strict dress code, and frankly," she gestured at Simone's comfortable travel attire with the kind of dismissive wave that suggested she was doing Simone a favor by pointing out her obvious inadequacy rather than allowing her to embarrass herself further. The heat that rose in Simone's chest was familiar, the same sensation she'd felt in countless boardrooms where colleagues questioned her credentials in international negotiations, where powerful men addressed her assistants instead of speaking to her directly in first-class airplane cabins, where flight attendants asked if she was sure she was in the right seat. But this heat was accompanied by something else now, a cold calculation that came from knowing she had the power to do something about the disrespect, rather than simply enduring it as the price of existing while black in spaces that weren't designed for her presence. "I understand the dress code," Simone said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled patience that comes from years of dealing with people who mistake authority for intelligence. "But if you could just check my name in your system." "I don't need to check your name to know you're in the wrong line," came a booming voice from behind the counter, cutting through Simone's words like a cleaver through bone. The door marked manager swung open with the force of someone who'd been listening to the conversation, and had decided it was time to assert his authority over what he clearly considered an increasingly problematic situation. Derek Hoffman emerged from his office like a small-town king surveying his domain, and everything about him screamed middle management desperately trying to cosplay as executive leadership. He was tall in the way that some men mistake for commanding presence, wearing a suit that was expensive enough to signal his position but too tight in the shoulders, giving him the appearance of someone who'd bought his clothes for the person he thought he was, rather than the person he actually was. His hair was gelled with the kind of aggressive styling that looked like he'd declared war on any strand that dared to move naturally, creating a helmet-like appearance that somehow managed to make his already unremarkable features even more forgettable. Derek Hoffman was everything wrong with corporate culture distilled into one aggressively mediocre man who'd confused being loud with being right, who'd mistaken his ability to make other people uncomfortable for actual leadership skills, who'd built his entire professional identity around the power to say no to people who couldn't fight back. He'd been with Skybridge Airlines for 8 years, climbing the ranks not through excellence or innovation, but through his willingness to make the kind of cruel decisions that more ethical managers couldn't stomach, cutting employee benefits while increasing passenger fees, ignoring customer complaints while maximizing short-term profits, creating the kind of toxic work environment where decent people quit and only the most morally flexible employees thrived. Simone recognized him immediately from the personnel files she'd studied during her transatlantic flight. The documents that painted a picture of a man who treated customer service like a zero-sum game where any dignity granted to passengers somehow diminished his own authority. His performance reviews were filled with praise for his cost-cutting measures and his ability to handle difficult customers, which was corporate speak for his willingness to be cruel to anyone who couldn't complain loudly enough to affect the airline's stock price. The complaints against him painted a pattern of behavior that was too consistent to be accidental, too targeted to be unconscious bias, and too protected by upper management to be anything other than deliberate policy. Why is this line stalled? Derek demanded, addressing Angela, while completely ignoring Simone's presence, as if she was a piece of problematic luggage that had somehow gained the ability to speak, but wasn't worthy of direct acknowledgement. We have board members arriving for the emergency budget meeting in 20 minutes, and I don't want any clutter disrupting the professional atmosphere they expect when they're making decisions about this company's future. The word clutter hit the air like a slap, and Simone felt something shift inside her chest, a gear clicking into place that she recognized from every major business acquisition she'd ever completed, every hostile takeover she'd ever orchestrated, every moment when she'd decided that being polite was less important than being effective. Derek Hoffman had just made a choice that was going to define the rest of his career, though he was too arrogant and too stupid to realize that the woman he'd just dismissed as clutter was about to become the most significant problem he'd ever encountered. "She won't leave, Mr. Hoffman." Angela said, her voice taking on the whining quality of someone who was eager to shift blame for her own poor customer service onto the customer themselves. I directed her to economy check-in, but she claims she has a meeting in the lounge and won't accept that she doesn't belong here. Derek turned his gaze to Simone for the first time, and the look in his eyes was everything that was wrong with American corporate culture in a single expression. It wasn't curiosity about how he might help a customer. It was annoyance at being forced to deal with someone who'd clearly wandered outside their designated area and was now disrupting his carefully maintained hierarchy. He saw a black woman in casual clothes with an old bag, and his brain immediately categorized her as someone who was either confused about where she belonged or deliberately trying to access spaces above her station in life because the possibility that she might actually belong in those spaces never even entered his mind as worth considering. Derek's laugh was like broken glass scraping against concrete, sharp and ugly and designed to cut. "Vivian Banks," he said, his voice dripping with the kind of contempt that men like him reserved for people they considered beneath their attention. "Right? And I'm Barack Obama. Listening, lady. Vivian Banks is the CEO of Banks Global. I saw her picture in Forbes magazine. She wears Chanel suits and travels with an entourage of 10 people. She doesn't look like... He gestured at Simone with a dismissive wave that encompassed everything from her comfortable travel clothes to her natural beauty that didn't require magazine-quality makeup to be stunning. The prejudice was so naked, so casually vicious, that it was almost breathtaking in its honesty. Derek Hoffman had just revealed everything anyone needed to know about how he saw the world, how he categorized human beings based on their appearance, rather than their accomplishments, how he'd built his entire understanding of power and success around visual cues that he'd never bothered to question or examine. In his mind, successful black women existed only in carefully curated magazine photos, not in airport terminals wearing comfortable clothes after weeks of humanitarian work, not in spaces where they might be mistaken for people who cleaned those spaces rather than people who owned them. "Appearances can be deceiving," Simone said, her hand tightening on the handle of her father's old duffel bag, feeling the worn leather that had traveled to every continent as she built an empire that spanned industries and continents. "I'm asking you one last time to let me into the lounge. I have business to attend to that affects every employee of this company and every passenger who flies on your planes." Derek leaned over the counter with the aggressive body language of a man who'd learned that invading people's personal space was an effective way to intimidate them into backing down his breath. Carrying the stale mixture of cheap coffee and mint gum that suggested he'd been preparing for important meetings by focusing on his appearance rather than his competence. "And I'm telling you one last time," he said, his voice rising with the kind of manufactured authority that insecure men use when they want to sound powerful but only succeed in sounding desperate. "Get out of my terminal before I call security and have you dragged out like the trespasser you obviously are. We're trying to run a premium airline here, and you are bringing down the property value just by standing in this space that was designed for a better class of people than whatever you represent." He turned his back on her with the dismissive confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his casual cruelty, who'd built his career on the assumption that people like Simone had no recourse against people like him, who believed that power meant the ability to humiliate others without accountability. "Angela," he called over his shoulder. "Call security if she's still polluting our professional environment in 30 seconds. I have important people to prepare for, and I won't have this kind of disruption when they arrive." Simone stood there for a moment that stretched like eternity, watching Derek's retreating form with the kind of calm assessment that predators use when they're calculating the exact moment to strike. The familiar heat in her chest had transformed into something much colder and infinitely more dangerous. The kind of focused fury that had built multinational corporations and toppled governments and changed the course of entire industries. She pulled out her phone, a custom encrypted device that looked ordinary but was connected to communication networks that most people couldn't imagine existed, and sent a single text message that would set in motion events Derek Hoffman couldn't possibly comprehend. "Vincent," she typed. "Execute Phase 1. I'm in position. They have no idea what's about to hit them." The response came back in less than 10 seconds. "Teams in position. Press release ready. Legal documentation complete. Waiting for your signal to proceed." Simone walked away from the prestige counter, but she didn't leave the terminal or even the immediate area. Instead, she moved with the purposeful calm of someone who'd just initiated a military operation, finding a seat near a structural pillar that offered a direct line of sight to the entrance of the Prestige Lounge, while keeping her partially concealed from casual observation. She needed to watch what happened next, needed to see exactly how deep the rot in Skybridge Airlines went before she decided whether the infection could be treated or if the entire diseased organism needed to be amputated from the aviation industry. From her tablet, she accessed the security camera feeds that she now owned by virtue of owning the infrastructure they were mounted on, cycling through multiple angles of the Prestige Lounge and the adjacent gate areas, where Derek was currently performing his eager puppy routine for the board members, who were beginning to arrive for what they believed was an emergency strategy meeting. These were the people who'd driven Skybridge Airlines to the edge of bankruptcy while paying themselves millions in bonuses, who'd ignored hundreds of employee complaints and thousands of customer grievances while focusing exclusively on quarterly profit margins that looked good in PowerPoint presentations but were built on the systematic demoralization of everyone who actually made the airline function. Julian Cross, the acting CEO, swept through the terminal with the kind of artificial grandeur that men adopt when they've convinced themselves that other people's deference is evidence of their own superiority, rather than evidence of their ability to exploit power structures that were designed to benefit people like them. He was followed by Patricia Webb, the VP of Human Resources, who'd developed an innovative approach to workplace harassment complaints that involved filing them in boxes that were never opened and scheduling follow-up meetings that were never held effectively, creating a system where reporting abuse became just another form of abuse that exhausted victims into silence. Robert Kane, the chief financial officer, carried himself with the smug satisfaction of someone who'd discovered that cooking books was actually much easier than cooking food, that moving numbers around on spreadsheets could create the appearance of fiscal responsibility while hiding the kind of maintenance deferrals and safety shortcuts that would eventually kill people but would boost this quarter's earnings reports. These were the people who'd created the culture that produced Derek Hoffman, who'd built an organizational structure where cruelty was rewarded as efficiency and basic human decency was dismissed as unprofitable sentiment. Simone watched Derek's transformation as he spotted the arriving board members, his entire demeanor shifting from petty tyrant to obsequious servant in the space of seconds. He rushed to greet them with the kind of desperate enthusiasm that suggested his job security depended on their continued approval, which it had until approximately 3 hours ago, when ownership of his employment contract had transferred to someone who'd been taking detailed notes on his performance. He offered drinks, adjusted chairs, and laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny, performing the role of competent regional director for people who were too self-absorbed to notice that his competence was entirely fictional. They were gathering for what they thought was a strategy meeting to develop defensive measures against a hostile takeover attempt, completely unaware that the takeover had already been completed while they were sleeping off hangovers and planning their next expense account dinners. The irony was so perfect it was almost artistic. They were about to discuss how to prevent something that had already happened, how to maintain control. They'd already lost, how to preserve careers that had already ended. Through her earpiece, Simone could hear Vincent's team conducting final preparations for what was essentially a corporate military operation. Security personnel were moving into position throughout the terminal. Legal documentation was being prepared for immediate filing with federal aviation authorities, and press releases were being distributed to media outlets that would ensure Derek Hoffman's humiliation would be witnessed by millions of people who'd experienced similar treatment, but had never seen justice served quite so publicly. From her concealed position, Simone had a perfect view of the conference room where Derek was currently pointing at graphs and charts that showed how his cost-cutting measures had improved short-term profitability, while completely ignoring the long-term damage to employee morale, customer satisfaction, and mechanical safety that would eventually destroy the company he was pretending to manage. She could see the board members nodding along with his presentation, their faces showing the kind of engaged attention that people perform when they're being paid enormous salaries to pretend that obviously bad ideas are actually evidence of strategic brilliance. The scene was perfect in its encapsulation of everything wrong with corporate America: rich people congratulating themselves for their cleverness while the people who actually made their companies function were treated like disposable resources. Executive leadership that confused cruelty with efficiency, and decision-making processes that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability or basic human dignity. It was exactly the kind of toxic culture that Simone had built her career, destroying the kind of institutional dysfunction that she specialized in identifying, isolating, and surgically removing from otherwise healthy organizations. But this wasn't just business for Simone. This was personal in the way that justice is always personal when you've experienced injustice, when you've been dismissed and discounted and disrespected by people who assumed they'd never be held accountable for their casual cruelty. Every time she'd been told she didn't belong somewhere, she'd earned the right to be, Every time someone had spoken to her assistant instead of speaking to her directly, every time someone had assumed she was the help instead of the person who could help or hurt their career, had been leading to this moment when she had the power to show people like Derek Hoffman exactly what accountability looked like when it was delivered with precision and finality. The moment had arrived for Simone to transform from observer to participant, from the dismissed woman in the hoodie to the force of nature that was about to reshape Derek Hoffman's understanding of power consequences and the price of treating human beings like disposable obstacles to his comfort. She stood up with the fluid grace of someone who'd spent years moving through spaces where she wasn't welcome but belonged anyway, smoothing down the black turtleneck that had been hidden beneath her cashmere hoodie, a simple but perfectly tailored garment that somehow managed to look both understated and unmistakably expensive in the way that true luxury always does. Her security detail, which had been shadowing her invisibly from exactly 20 feet of distance throughout her time in the terminal, moved into position with the kind of choreographed precision that suggested military training and extensive experience protecting people who attracted the kind of attention that required professional management. They weren't obvious about it, weren't wearing obvious earpieces or standing in formation, but anyone who understood security protocols would recognize the way they moved, the way they positioned themselves to control access routes, while maintaining sightlines that allowed them to respond to threats before those threats materialized into actual danger. Simone walked back toward the prestige counter with the purposeful stride of someone who owned the ground she was walking on, which she literally did. Now, though, the people working behind that counter were still operating under the assumption that they had the authority to determine who belonged in spaces they didn't actually control. Angela was still aggressively scrolling through her phone, but something in the air had changed, some shift in the atmospheric pressure that made her look up, just as Simone walked past the velvet rope that was supposed to keep undesirable people away from the sacred space of premium customer service. "Hey," Angela shrieked with the indignation of someone whose entire sense of authority was built around enforcing arbitrary boundaries that someone had just casually ignored. "You can't go in there. That area is restricted to premium passengers only, and I already explained that you don't meet the requirements for access." But Simone didn't stop, didn't acknowledge the protest, didn't even slow her pace as she pushed through the heavy frosted glass doors that led into the prestige lounge itself. The interior space was designed to convey exclusivity through the kind of generic luxury that focus groups had determined would make wealthy people feel appropriately pampered. Cool air that smelled of expensive perfume and fresh lilies, soft lighting that was supposed to be soothing but actually felt like the artificial twilight of an expensive funeral home, leather furniture that was more about appearance than comfort, and the kind of hushed atmosphere that was supposed to signal sophistication, but actually just felt like suppressed conversation. The few passengers who were scattered throughout the lounge looked up from their tablets and phones with the mild curiosity that wealthy people display when something unusual happens in their carefully curated environment. Not alarm, exactly, but the kind of attention that suggested they were wondering if they were about to witness something that would disrupt their peaceful consumption of free premium alcohol and artisanal snacks. Angela was indeed hot on Simone's heels, her voice rising with the desperate authority of someone who was rapidly losing control of a situation she was supposed to be managing. "Security to the Prestige Lounge," Angela was saying into her radio, her voice carrying the mix of panic and indignation that customer service representatives experience when customers refuse to be managed according to established protocols. "We have an unauthorized individual who has breached the premium area and is refusing to comply with staff directions to leave the restricted space immediately." Simone's destination was the conference room at the back of the lounge, a glass-walled space where Derek was currently standing at the head of a polished mahogany table pointing at a presentation screen with the kind of animated enthusiasm that middle managers display when they're trying to convince more powerful people that their jobs are essential and their ideas are valuable. She could see the board members arranged around the table in their expensive suits. their faces showing the kind of engaged attention that people perform when they're being paid enormous salaries to attend meetings that could have been emails nodding along with Derek's presentation about trimming operational costs and maximizing shareholder value through strategic efficiency improvements. The conference room door was locked, secured with the kind of electronic card reader that was supposed to ensure that only authorized personnel could access sensitive business discussions. But Simone reached into her pocket and produced a black card with no visible markings, no company logo, no identification numbers, the kind of universal access device that suggested connections to security systems that most people didn't know existed. She swiped the card against the reader with the casual confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before, and the small LED light shifted from red to green with a soft electronic chirp that was barely audible but somehow managed to cut through the conference room's conversation like a blade. The lock clicked with mechanical finality, and Simone pushed the door open just as Derek was explaining how his innovative approach to employee scheduling had reduced labor costs by 17%, while only increasing customer complaint rates by 12% numbers, that he was presenting as evidence of his strategic brilliance, rather than his systematic destruction of everything that made an airline function properly. The conversation died instantly. 12 heads turning in perfect synchronization like a choreographed performance of corporate surprise, their faces showing the kind of confusion that powerful people experience when their carefully controlled environments are suddenly disrupted by variables they hadn't anticipated. Derek was mid-sentence about the importance of maintaining profitability margins when he saw Simone standing in the doorway, and his face went through a transformation that was almost artistic in its completeness, shifting from confident authority to confused irritation to slowly dawning horror as his brain began processing the implications of seeing the woman he'd just dismissed standing in a space she supposedly had no right to access. The laser pointer in his hand dropped to the table with a plastic clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence, and his mouth remained open, as if he was still trying to finish a sentence that his brain had abandoned halfway through. "You have got to be kidding me." Derek sputtered his voice, carrying the kind of outraged disbelief that bullies experience when their victims refuse to stay victimized, when people they've dismissed refuse to remain dismissed, when the natural order they've constructed around their own authority is suddenly challenged by forces they don't understand and can't control. "You again. How did you possibly get in here? This is a restricted area for authorized personnel only, Julian Cross." The acting CEO frowned behind his expensive glasses with the kind of annoyed confusion that executives display when their carefully scheduled meetings are disrupted by problems they're supposed to have people to handle for them. His voice carried the dismissive authority of someone who'd spent decades having other people remove obstacles from his path so he could focus on the important work of making strategic decisions about things he didn't actually understand. "Derek," he said, "who is this woman? And why is she interrupting our discussion about quarterly performance metrics?" "Some crazy woman from the terminal, sir," Derek said, rushing toward Simone with his hands outstretched as if he was planning to physically remove her from the conference room himself. His face red with the kind of embarrassment that comes when your professional competence is being questioned in front of people who control your career advancement. "She thinks she's some kind of VIP customer, but I already told security to handle her removal from the premises. She's clearly having some kind of mental breakdown and has somehow managed to breach our security protocols." He stopped just inches from Simone's face, close enough that she could smell his desperation along with his coffee breath, close enough that his aggressive body language was clearly intended to intimidate her into backing down and apologizing for disrupting the important work of important people who had important decisions to make about maximizing profits while minimizing human dignity. "I told you to leave," he said, his voice rising with the kind of manufactured authority that weak men use when they want to sound powerful but only succeed in revealing their own insecurity. "Now you've broken into a private corporate meeting between executives who are trying to solve complex business problems. This is criminal trespassing, and you're going to jail for thinking you can waltz into spaces that were never meant for people like you." Simone stood her ground with the unwavering stability of someone who'd faced down hostile boardrooms and aggressive competitors and international negotiators who'd tried to intimidate her with everything from veiled threats to explicit racism, never flinching, never stepping backward, never giving an inch of ground to people who mistook their temporary authority for permanent power. She looked past Derek's red face and locked eyes with Julian Cross, the man who was supposed to be running the airline, but was actually just the latest in a series of executives who'd been hired to extract as much money as possible from the company before it inevitably collapsed under the weight of its own dysfunction. "I believe there's a seat for me at this table," Julian Simone said, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd just revealed a piece of information that was going to change everyone's understanding of the situation they thought they were in. "Perhaps we should discuss the recent changes in ownership structure that seem to have escaped your attention during your important presentations about cost-cutting and efficiency improvements." Julian Cross looked at Simone with the kind of squinting confusion that executives display when they encounter information that doesn't fit into the categories their assistants usually use to filter problems before they reach the executive level. His expensive glasses reflecting the conference room's artificial lighting as he tried to process what he was seeing and hearing. He'd never met Simone Reynolds in person, had only seen carefully staged publicity photos where she appeared in full makeup and couture clothing surrounded by the kind of corporate theater that business magazines used to illustrate success stories. So the woman standing in his conference room in comfortable travel clothes didn't match the mental image he'd constructed of what important people were supposed to look like. "Get her out of here," Julian muttered with the dismissive wave that powerful men use when they want problems to disappear without having to think about the human cost of making those problems disappear. His attention already turning back to the presentation screen as if the solution to unwanted interruptions was simply ignoring them until other people made them go away. "We have a genuine crisis to manage, and we don't have time to waste on whatever delusion this woman is experiencing about her importance to our business operations." Derek grabbed Simone's arm with the kind of aggressive force that men use when they've decided that physical intimidation is their last resort for maintaining control over situations that are slipping away from them. His grip painful enough to leave marks tight enough to communicate his belief that he had the right to put his hands on anyone who challenged his authority in spaces he considered his territory. "You heard the man," Derek roared, his voice carrying the desperate edge that bullies develop when they realize their usual tactics aren't working but don't know any other way to assert dominance. "Let's go. March yourself out of here before I have you arrested for assault, because that's what we're going to call it when you refuse to comply with lawful orders from authorized personnel." Simone yanked her arm back with surprising strength that caught Derek off guard. The kind of controlled power that comes from years of martial arts training and regular exercise regimens that most people didn't associate with corporate executives. Her movement so smooth and decisive that Derek stumbled backward and had to catch himself against the conference table to avoid falling. "Don't touch me," she said, her voice carrying the kind of cold authority that made everyone in the room suddenly understand that they were dealing with someone who was accustomed to being obeyed rather than someone who was accustomed to obeying. "Then move," Derek screamed, pointing toward the glass door with the kind of theatrical gesture that was supposed to convey absolute authority but actually revealed absolute desperation. His face now red enough to suggest serious cardiovascular stress brought on by the realization that his usual methods of controlling difficult people weren't having their intended effect. "You see that bench out there next to the vending machine? If you want to wait for the police to arrest you for criminal trespassing and disrupting legitimate business operations, you can wait outside like the rest of the people who don't belong in spaces designed for professionals who actually contribute to the economy." The room went silent with the kind of horrified quiet that follows when someone says something so inappropriate that even their allies can't pretend they didn't hear it. The kind of raw, ugly honesty that reveals what people really think about social hierarchies and human worth when they believe they're safe from consequences. Even the arrogant board members who'd spent decades ignoring employee complaints and customer grievances while focusing exclusively on stock prices and bonus structures looked uncomfortable at Derek's choice of words, their faces showing the kind of discomfort that comes when someone says out loud the things that are usually expressed through policy decisions and budget allocations. Simone stared at Derek with the kind of focused intensity that made him squirm under her gaze. Memorizing his face, cataloging the contempt in his eyes, recording every detail of this moment when he'd revealed exactly who he was and what he believed about people who didn't look like him or dress like him or signal their wealth in ways he'd been trained to recognize. This was the moment she'd been waiting for, the perfect crystallization of everything wrong with the culture she was about to dismantle, the ideal demonstration of why some people deserved power and others needed to have power taken away from them permanently. "Wait outside," she repeated slowly, testing the words like a wine sommelier, testing a vintage, letting them settle on her tongue so she could appreciate their full flavor of casual cruelty and institutional arrogance. "You want me to wait outside?" "Yes," Derek sneered, his confidence returning now that he'd made his position clear and established his authority over someone who was obviously confused about her place in the social hierarchy. "Wait outside for 5 minutes while the police come to arrest you for trespassing and disruption of legitimate business operations. Maybe that will teach you to respect boundaries that exist for very good reasons." Simone nodded with a small, terrifying smile that didn't reach her eyes, but somehow managed to fill the room with a sense of impending catastrophe, the kind of expression that apex predators wear right before they demonstrate why they're at the top of the food chain. 5 minutes, she said, her voice carrying a note of something that made everyone in the room suddenly feel like they were standing on unstable ground. "Okay, Derek, I'll wait outside." She turned and walked out of the conference room with the measured pace of someone who was implementing a carefully planned strategy rather than retreating from a confrontation. But she didn't leave the lounge entirely. Instead, she positioned herself just on the other side of the glass wall where everyone inside could see her, clearly visible to all 12 executives who were now watching her with the kind of fascinated horror that people experience when they sense they're about to witness something significant, but can't predict exactly what form that significance is going to take. Simone took out her phone and dialed a number that connected her directly to Vincent Castellanos, her chief operating officer, a man who'd spent 20 years in military intelligence before joining Reynolds Global, and who understood the importance of timing precision and overwhelming response when dealing with hostile targets. "Vincent," she said, her voice clear and calm and carrying easily through the glass that separated her from the conference room, "patch me into the conference room audio system. I want them to hear every word of what happens next." Inside the conference room, the speakerphone on the center of the mahogany table crackled to life with a feedback whine that made everyone wince and cover their ears, the kind of electronic screech that suggested technical problems or equipment malfunctions, but was actually the sound of someone with superior technical resources taking control of communication systems that other people thought they controlled. The sound filled the room and seemed to come from everywhere at once, bouncing off the walls and ceiling with the kind of omnipresent quality that made it impossible to ignore or escape. "What is that noise?" Julian asked, looking around the room with the kind of confused irritation that executives display when their carefully controlled environments are disrupted by technical problems that they expect other people to solve for them. His voice carrying the entitled assumption that someone would immediately appear to fix whatever was wrong and restore the meeting to its intended focus on quarterly performance metrics and cost reduction strategies. Then Simone's voice boomed through the speakers with crystal-clear digital quality, filling every corner of the conference room and seeming to come from the walls themselves, carrying the kind of authority that made everyone present suddenly understand that they were no longer in control of their own meeting space. "This is Simone Reynolds," the voice said, each word precisely enunciated and carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "and I have decided to wait outside as requested. But while I wait, I'm going to make a few changes to the organizational structure of this company." Gavin looked at the speakerphone in the center of the table. then looked through the glass wall at the woman standing calmly with her cell phone pressed to her ear, and his face went through a transformation that was visible from across the room, as the color drained from his skin so fast that he looked like someone who'd just received news of a terminal medical diagnosis. His knees buckled visibly, and he had to grab the back of a chair to steady himself as his brain began processing the implications of what was happening. The possibility that he'd just made the worst mistake of his professional life by dismissing someone who apparently had the resources and authority to take control of corporate communication systems. It can't be. He whispered, his voice barely audible over the speaker system that was carrying Simone's words to every corner of the room, his hands shaking as he tried to grip the chair that was the only thing keeping him upright as his world began collapsing around him with the devastating efficiency of a controlled demolition. 5 minutes, Derek Simone's voice echoed through the room with the kind of calm finality that executioners use when they're explaining the process to condemned prisoners, each word carrying the weight of inevitable consequences that could no longer be avoided or negotiated. You gave me 5 minutes to wait outside. Let's see what I can accomplish in that time frame. The air in the conference room had transformed from the recycled atmosphere of corporate efficiency into something thick and toxic, charged with the kind of electrical tension that precedes major storms, and 12 highly paid executives sat frozen in their expensive chairs staring at the Polycom speakerphone in the center of the mahogany table as if it were a bomb with a countdown timer that was measuring the remaining seconds of their careers rather than the remaining minutes of their meeting. Through the glass wall that separated them from the main lounge area, they could see Simone standing with the calm composure of someone who was orchestrating a military operation, her phone pressed to her ear as she spoke in measured tones that somehow managed to fill their sealed conference room through speakers they didn't know she could access. "This is impossible," Derek stammered, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to maintain his authority while his brain processed information that didn't fit into any category he understood, looking frantically between Julian Cross and the woman outside who was somehow commanding their communication systems. "Sir, this has to be some kind of elaborate hoax or technical hack. That woman is just a distraction while someone else manipulates our security protocols. I'll go out there and physically remove her so we can call our IT department to fix whatever system breach is allowing this disruption." "Sit down," Derek Simone's voice commanded from the speakers, with the tone that animal trainers use when they're correcting disobedient pets, not a shout or a scream, but something much more devastating. The kind of quiet authority that brooked no argument and expected immediate compliance. The command wasn't loud, but it filled the room with the weight of absolute expectation, and to everyone's shock and Derek's humiliation, he found himself sitting down without conscious decision, his body responding to the authority in her voice before his mind could process the implications of obeying orders from someone he'd just tried to have arrested. Minute 1. Simone continued, her voice carrying through the speakers with the kind of clinical precision that surgeons use when they're explaining procedures to medical students. "Let's discuss the recent changes in ownership structure that seem to have escaped your attention during your presentation about cost reduction strategies and employee efficiency improvements." Suddenly, the massive 85-inch smart screen at the head of the conference room, which had been displaying Derek's PowerPoint presentation about reducing cabin crew salaries and eliminating customer service positions, flickered with the electronic interference that suggested someone with superior technical access was overriding the local control systems. The screen went completely black for several seconds, creating a void that somehow felt ominous in the context of everything else that was happening, then refreshed with the kind of crisp digital clarity that revealed professional-grade equipment and expert technical support. A document appeared on the screen that made Julian Cross shoot to his feet with enough force to knock over his leather chair, his face going pale gray as he recognized the legal formatting and official seals that marked documents of enormous financial and legal significance. He leaned over the polished table, squinting at the screen through his expensive glasses as he tried to process what he was seeing, his hands shaking as he gripped the table's edge for support. That's the Project Icarus acquisition file," Julian whispered, his voice carrying the kind of horror that people experience when they realize they've been outmaneuvered by forces they never saw coming, that they've been playing a game where the rules were changed without their knowledge and they've already lost without realizing the contest was over. How did she access classified merger documents that are supposed to be secured behind multiple layers of corporate security? Yes. Julian. Simone's voice confirmed through the speakers, with the satisfaction of someone who was revealing the punchline to a joke that only she understood. You thought you were selling a controlling interest to a shell corporation called Blue Horizon Ventures as a way to hide your massive debt obligations and extract maximum value before the inevitable bankruptcy filing that would leave your creditors and employees holding worthless paper while you escaped with golden parachutes worth tens of millions of dollars. Simone tapped something on her tablet, and the document on the screen scrolled down with smooth precision to reveal sections that contained information Derek and Julian had never seen, despite being the supposed architects of the transaction details about corporate structure and financial backing that their own lawyers had somehow failed to provide during months of due diligence that was apparently much less diligent than they'd believed. The scrolling stopped at a section titled Ultimate Beneficial Ownership that contained names and corporate relationships that made Julian's face cycle through several different shades of pale. But if you had performed actual due diligence instead of focusing exclusively on your personal financial extraction, Simone continued, her voice carrying the kind of educational tone that professors use when they're explaining concepts to students who haven't done the required reading, you would have discovered that Blue Horizon Ventures is a wholly owned subsidiary of Reynolds Global Industries, which means that you weren't selling to anonymous investors who would allow you to continue your systematic destruction of this company. You were selling to me. The screen scrolled down further to reveal the signature page of the acquisition documents and the sight of Simone's name on the buyer line, along with timestamps that showed the transaction had been completed hours earlier, created a moment of silence so complete that the conference room's air circulation system seemed loud by comparison. The date stamp showed today's date, and the time stamp showed that the final signatures had been executed while most of them were still having breakfast and preparing for what they thought would be a defensive strategy meeting. I own the planes, Simone said, her voice echoing through the speakers with the kind of calm finality that suggested she was just getting started with her revelations. I own the hangars. I own the maintenance facilities. I own the computer systems you're using to access company files. I own the coffee machine you're drinking from. And most importantly, I own the employment contracts of every single person in this room. Derek looked from the screen to the woman standing outside the glass wall with an expression that suggested his brain was struggling to process information that challenged everything he thought he understood about power, authority, and social hierarchies. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow as he understood that the trash he'd told to wait outside was actually the person who now owned the building they were sitting in, the company they worked for, and the careers they'd spent decades building. Minute 2. Simone continued with the methodical precision of someone working through a checklist that had been prepared well in advance. Let's examine the performance metrics that led to this change in ownership. Starting with some interesting email communications that seem to have been excluded from your presentation about operational efficiency improvements. The screen changed again with the seamless transition that suggested professional technical support and access to databases that the board members had assumed were secure from external scrutiny. This time displaying a series of internal email communications with headers that showed they'd originated from Derek's official company account and had been sent to various department heads over the past 18 months. The emails appeared in chronological order, creating a timeline that told a story of systematic negligence disguised as cost-saving innovation. The first email that appeared on screen made Patricia Webb, the VP of Human Resources, gasp audibly and cover her mouth with her hand, her face showing the kind of horror that people experience when they see their worst institutional secrets exposed to public scrutiny. The subject line read, Priority Directive Maintenance Schedule, Modifications, and the sender was clearly identified as Derek Hoffman, Regional Director, with a timestamp that showed it had been sent during regular business hours to the Chief of Maintenance Operations. From Derek Hoffman to Maintenance Department, Simone's voice read aloud, giving voice to words that Derek had assumed would never be seen by anyone outside the maintenance chain of command. Subject immediate cost reduction measures for Q3 performance targets. Body of message: we are significantly over budget for quarterly maintenance expenditures. Effective immediately patch and defer all non-critical component replacements until Q4 budget cycle. I don't care what the federal safety regulations recommend. I care about hitting profit margins that will determine bonus distributions for management personnel. A collective gasp went around the table as the implications of Derek's email became clear to everyone in the room, even those who'd spent years turning blind eyes to the corner-cutting and rule-bending that had become standard practice in their pursuit of quarterly profit targets that looked impressive in stockholder reports but were built on systematically deferred maintenance and ignored safety protocols. Flight 402 carries 180 passengers. Simone said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting, would have the kind of quiet intensity that made everyone lean forward to catch every word. And you risked 180 lives to save $4,000 in parts and labor, Derek. And you, Julian, approved the budget parameters that incentivize this kind of decision-making through your executive compensation structure that rewards short-term cost reductions over long-term safety compliance. Derek was shaking now, visible tremors running through his hands as sweat beaded on his forehead and dripped down his face, creating the kind of physical breakdown that occurs when people realize they've been caught doing things that could result in criminal prosecution rather than just professional embarrassment. He looked through the glass wall at Simone, who was standing calmly with her phone still pressed to her ear, her expression showing the kind of cold professionalism that suggested she was just getting started with her systematic destruction of everything he'd built his career on. I was following corporate directives. Derek sputtered his words, directed at the glass wall as if Simone might somehow be moved by his claims of institutional pressure and shared responsibility. It's standard industry practice to optimize maintenance schedules based on budgetary constraints and operational demands. Every airline in America makes these kinds of cost-benefit calculations. It is attempted manslaughter. Simone corrected, her voice cutting through his desperate justifications with the precision of a legal professional who understood the difference between industry practice and criminal liability. And I have forwarded these emails along with maintenance records and safety inspection reports that document the actual condition of the aircraft components you ordered patched instead of replaced to the Federal Aviation Administration and the FBI. They received comprehensive documentation packages exactly 2 minutes ago. Panic erupted around the conference table as board members who'd spent years insulating themselves from the operational details that might create legal liability suddenly realized they were potentially complicit in safety violations that could result in federal criminal charges rather than just civil penalties. Voices rose in the kind of desperate blame shifting that occurs when powerful people realize their careful legal protections might not be sufficient to shield them from consequences they'd never seriously considered. I didn't know about the safety implications, Julian shouted, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to distance himself from decisions he'd approved through budget allocations and performance incentives. This was Derek's operational management, not executive strategy. I want immediate legal representation before any further discussion of these matters. My company credit card shows a declined transaction notification. Sarah Jenkins said, staring at her phone with the confused expression of someone whose carefully managed corporate lifestyle was being dismantled in real time, and my building access badge is showing inactive status when I try to authenticate through the security system. Derek frantically tapped his phone screen with increasing desperation, trying to access company systems that had been his primary tools of authority and finding that every login attempt was being rejected by security protocols he didn't understand. My administrative privileges have been revoked, he said, his voice rising with panic as he realized that his ability to access the systems that controlled other people's employment was no longer under his control. I can't even log into the basic employee directory that I use to manage daily operations. I have just revoked your security clearances, your system access privileges, your corporate credit authorizations, and your building access credentials, Simone explained through the speakers with the calm efficiency of someone who'd planned this moment down to the smallest detail. Which means that, technically speaking, you are all now trespassing in a secure area of a federal airport facility without proper authorization, which is itself a federal crime that can result in imprisonment and permanent exclusion from commercial aviation facilities. Minute 4, Simone announced, and everyone in the room could hear her ending the phone call that had allowed her to speak through their communication system. The soft beep of disconnection that plunged them into a silence that felt somehow more ominous than the voice that had been systematically destroying their careers for the past several minutes. She lowered her phone from her ear and tapped gently on the glass wall with one knuckle, the soft sound somehow carrying more authority than Derek's earlier shouting had managed to convey. She pointed to the conference room door with the kind of gesture that suggested she was directing traffic rather than making requests, and Derek, desperate to salvage some shred of his authority and somehow regain control of a situation that had spiraled completely beyond his comprehension, scrambled to the door and grabbed the electronic handle with both hands, yanking and pulling with the kind of frantic energy that suggested he believed physical force could solve problems that were actually technological and legal in nature. The door wouldn't budge, secured by electronic locks that had been engaged remotely by someone with administrative access to building security systems that Derek had never known existed, and his attempts to force the door open created the kind of pathetic spectacle that occurs when people who are accustomed to having others solve their problems are suddenly forced to confront obstacles they can't delegate or intimidate away. "Let us out." Derek pounded on the reinforced glass with his fists, creating a rhythmic beating that echoed through the conference room but had no effect on the sophisticated locking mechanisms that were controlled by systems he didn't understand. "You can't keep us trapped in here like criminals. This is kidnapping and false imprisonment and a dozen other federal crimes." Simone just mouthed one word through the glass, a single syllable that somehow contained the entire weight of the consequences that were about to be delivered to people who'd spent years believing they were immune to consequences. Wait. For the remaining 60 seconds of the 5-minute deadline that Derek had so confidently imposed, Simone stood with her back turned to the glass wall, completely ignoring the 12 executives who were pounding on the windows and shouting threats and promises and desperate pleas for mercy, their voices creating a cacophony that sounded like trapped insects buzzing frantically against glass barriers that were never going to yield to their panic. She focused instead on the terminal floor beyond the lounge, watching with the calm patience of a predator that knows its prey is already caught and can afford to take its time with the final approach. From the far end of the concourse, moving through the scattered groups of delayed passengers and airport personnel with the kind of purposeful formation that suggested military training and serious intent. A group of 20 people appeared wearing dark tactical suits with the Reynolds Global Security insignia prominently displayed on their chest pockets. They moved in a precise V formation that cut through the crowd like a shark fin moving through water, their coordination so perfect that other travelers instinctively stepped aside to clear their path without consciously understanding why they felt compelled to move. Leading this security team was Vincent Castellanos, a man whose physical presence could best be described as intimidating in the way that industrial machinery is intimidating. He was built like a vending machine that had been given the ability to walk and think strategically, his shoulders broad enough to fill doorways, his height making him visible over crowds, and his face bearing a scar that ran through his left eyebrow like a permanent reminder that he'd survived encounters that would have ended other people's careers or lives. He moved with the controlled grace that comes from decades of military experience combined with corporate security training. his eyes constantly scanning the environment for potential threats while his expression remained professionally neutral. Vincent approached Simone with the kind of respectful efficiency that suggested a working relationship built on mutual trust and shared understanding of objectives that didn't require extensive verbal communication to coordinate. "Miss Reynolds," he said, his voice a deep rumble that seemed to emerge from somewhere near his chest rather than his throat, carrying the kind of authority that made people pay attention, without requiring volume to command respect. "The perimeter is secured according to your specifications. Local law enforcement is positioned at the main terminal exits, waiting for the handover of suspects, and federal aviation authorities have been notified of the safety violations and corporate malfeasance that requires immediate investigation." "Excellent," Simone replied, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose carefully orchestrated plan was proceeding exactly as designed, with contingencies in place for every possible complication and backup systems ready to deploy if any aspect of the operation encountered unexpected resistance. "Open the conference room, Vincent. It's time for these people to face the consequences of their choices." Vincent approached the conference room door and swiped a master access card that overrode the local security locks, and the door hissed open with mechanical precision that released not just the physical barrier, but also the smell of fear that had been building inside the sealed space for the past 5 minutes. A palpable atmospheric change that suggested the emotional breakdown of people who'd suddenly realized their carefully constructed professional lives were collapsing faster than they could process or respond to the destruction. Derek was the first to attempt escape, shoving past Patricia Webb with the desperate aggression of someone who'd decided that physical force was his last remaining option for avoiding consequences he couldn't negotiate or intimidate his way out of his face, showing the kind of wild panic that occurs when bullies realize their victims have suddenly acquired the power to fight back with interest. "Out of my way," he screamed, his voice cracking with strain, as he sprinted toward the gap between Vincent and the door frame, believing that speed and desperation might somehow allow him to escape a situation that had been designed to have no escape routes. He managed exactly 2 steps before Vincent reached out with one massive hand and grabbed Derek by the back of his expensive suit jacket, lifting him completely off his feet with the casual ease that suggested this kind of physical intervention was a routine part of his professional responsibilities. Derek's legs kicked uselessly in the air like a child having a tantrum, his expensive shoes cycling through empty space as he discovered that his authority to intimidate other people had been permanently transferred to someone who was much better at physical intimidation than he could ever hope to be. "Sit," Vincent growled, dropping Derek back into his conference chair with enough force to create a bone-rattling impact that could be heard throughout the room, the kind of physical punctuation that made everyone else abandon any thoughts they might have entertained about attempting their own dramatic escapes from accountability. Simone walked into the conference room with the measured pace of someone who was savoring a moment she'd been anticipating for hours, her sneakers making soft sounds against the plush carpet that somehow seemed louder than Derek's earlier shouting had been, each step carrying the weight of authority that didn't require volume or aggression to command absolute attention from everyone present. She walked to the head of the conference table where Julian Cross was slumped in defeat, his expensive suit wrinkled from stress, and his face showing the kind of resignation that comes when people realize they've been completely outmaneuvered by opponents they'd never even known they were facing. She picked up the laser pointer that Derek had thrown onto the table during his earlier presentation about cost reduction strategies, holding the small device like a symbol of the authority he'd believed was his, but had actually been on loan from people who could revoke it at any time they chose. "You told me," Simone began, her voice carrying through the silent room with perfect clarity, "that the cleaning crew enters through the back entrance. You said this meeting was exclusively for executives, and that I should wait outside until you needed someone to empty the trash that accumulates in spaces where important people make important decisions." She leaned forward slightly, bringing her face closer to Derek's, so that he could see the absolute certainty in her eyes, the kind of unwavering focus that suggested this moment was the culmination of careful planning rather than spontaneous revenge. "Well, Derek, She continued her words precisely enunciated so that everyone in the room could hear and understand exactly what was happening. The trash collection service has arrived, but I'm not here to empty containers. I'm here to take out the garbage that's been contaminating this organization and poisoning the work environment for everyone who actually contributes to making this company function. She signaled to the security team with a simple gesture that had clearly been rehearsed and coordinated in advance, and Vincent's personnel moved into formation around the conference table with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested they'd performed similar operations many times before and knew exactly how to manage the removal of corporate personnel who were no longer welcome in their former positions of authority. "Escort them out," Simone commanded, her voice carrying the absolute authority of ownership that couldn't be questioned or appealed or negotiated with all of them immediately, and ensure that their departures are visible to everyone in the terminal who might be interested in observing what accountability looks like when it's delivered with precision and finality. The threatening text message burned on Simone's phone screen like a digital brand searing itself into her consciousness, each word carrying implications that transformed her moment of victory into something much more complex and dangerous than the simple corporate restructuring she'd thought she was implementing. The airline wasn't failing by accident. We were breaking it on purpose, and you just bought a crime scene. She read the message 3 times, her analytical mind immediately shifting from celebration mode into the kind of tactical thinking that had kept her alive and successful through decades of international business dealings that sometimes involved people who solved problems through methods that never appeared in Harvard Business School case studies. Simone didn't run toward the nearest exit or immediately call for additional security because she understood that in high-stakes corporate warfare, the people most likely to help you were often the same people most likely to betray you if the price was right. And the people most eager to provide protection were sometimes the ones who'd created the need for protection in the first place. Instead, she walked calmly toward the terminal exit with Vincent's security team maintaining their protective formation around her, her mind racing through the implications of what the text message revealed about the systematic destruction of Skybridge Airlines being something much more organized and financially motivated than simple incompetence and casual racism. "Change of plans," she said to Vincent as they reached the sliding doors that led to the ground transportation area, her voice carrying the kind of controlled urgency that suggested immediate tactical adjustments were needed without creating panic among her security personnel. "We're not going to the hotel for debriefing and media interviews. Take me directly to Hangar 4, where the maintenance operations are based. I need to see the physical evidence of what's been happening to these aircraft before whoever sent that text message has time to destroy documentation or eliminate witnesses." Vincent's expression shifted into the kind of professional concern that experienced security personnel develop when they recognize that their principals are making decisions that prioritize investigation over safety. His scarred eyebrow rising slightly as he processed the tactical implications of her request. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the respectful firmness that bodyguards use when they need to contradict their clients without undermining their authority. "That text message constitutes a direct threat against your personal safety. Moving to an isolated maintenance facility puts us in a tactically disadvantageous position where potential hostiles could control access routes and limit our ability to respond to multiple threat vectors. Skybridge Airlines has lost 3 aircraft over the past 5 years to what were officially classified as mechanical failures," Simone replied, pulling up files on her tablet that she'd reviewed during her transatlantic flight, but was now seeing in an entirely different context. The official reports blamed faulty wiring and component degradation, but Derek's emails mentioned something called Project Icarus, which isn't a maintenance schedule. It's a code name for something that involves systematic aircraft modification for purposes that have nothing to do with passenger safety or operational efficiency. 10 minutes later, a convoy of 3 black armored SUVs was tearing across the rain-soaked tarmac of JFK International Airport, dodging service vehicles and refueling trucks, while emergency lights flashed through the storm that was still battering the airfield with the kind of relentless intensity that suggested nature was providing appropriate atmospheric conditions for the investigation that was about to unfold. The vehicles moved with coordinated precision toward Hangar 4, a massive industrial structure located at the remote edge of the airport property, where the casual observer might not notice unusual activities that took place during overnight shifts when most airport personnel were focused on passenger operations rather than maintenance operations. Hangar 4 loomed out of the rain like a monument to industrial secrecy, its massive steel framework designed to accommodate the largest commercial aircraft while providing complete concealment from external observation. The kind of facility where work could be performed on sensitive projects without attracting attention from federal aviation inspectors or curious journalists who might ask inconvenient questions about modifications that weren't reflected in official maintenance documentation. Inside the hangar, a single Boeing 777 sat like a dissected specimen, its panels stripped away to reveal internal systems that had been extensively modified from their original factory specifications. The aircraft looked like the skeleton of some massive technological beast, with engines resting on heavy stands and access panels removed to expose wiring and hydraulic systems that had been rerouted in ways that didn't match the technical specifications that Boeing engineers had designed for passenger safety and operational reliability. The hangar was dimly lit by industrial lighting that created long shadows and distorted reflections against the aluminum skin of the dismantled aircraft, giving the entire space an ominous quality that suggested important work was being performed away from the scrutiny of people who might object to the nature of that work. "Who's the lead mechanic responsible for this operation?" Simone called out as she stepped from the SUV, her voice echoing in the cavernous space with the kind of authority that demanded immediate response from anyone who might be present in the facility, while Vincent's security team spread out in defensive positions that would allow them to respond to threats from multiple directions while maintaining clear sight lines to all potential access points. A man emerged from the wheel well of the aircraft with the slow, cautious movement of someone who'd learned to be suspicious of unexpected visitors, especially visitors who arrived with security teams and asked questions about work that was supposed to remain invisible to outside scrutiny. He appeared to be in his early 60s, with grease permanently stained into the lines of his face like a map of decades spent working with machinery that was designed to fly but had been modified for purposes that had nothing to do with aviation safety, and his name tag identified him as Rodriguez Senior Maintenance Technician, though his expression suggested he might be responsible for much more than routine technical maintenance. Rodriguez held a large wrench in his right hand like a weapon rather than a tool, his posture defensive and his eyes shifting between Simone's face and Vincent's security team as he tried to assess whether these unexpected visitors represented law enforcement, corporate management, or something potentially more dangerous than either of those options. "Who's asking these questions?" He grunted, his voice carrying the wariness that comes from years of working in environments where the wrong answer to the wrong person could result in consequences much more serious than employment termination. "Derek Hoffman sent you." Rodriguez continued his tone, suggesting that Derek's name was associated with pressures and demands that made his work more difficult and potentially more dangerous than it should have been, because I already told him I'm not signing off on these fuel pump modifications until someone provides me with documentation that proves these changes are approved by federal aviation authorities, and nobody has been able to produce that paperwork despite months of requests. "Derek Hoffman is currently in federal custody," Simone replied, stepping into the harsh industrial lighting that revealed her face clearly for the first time since she'd entered the hangar, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that suggested she was someone who outranked Derek by several levels of corporate hierarchy. "I'm Simone Reynolds, and as of this afternoon I own this aircraft, this facility, and every modification that's been performed on this fleet. I want to understand exactly what Project Icarus involves and why these aircraft are failing at rates that suggest systematic sabotage rather than normal mechanical degradation." Rodriguez dropped the wrench with a clatter that seemed impossibly loud in the enclosed space, the tool striking the concrete floor and bouncing several times before settling with the kind of metallic finality that suggested a decision point had been reached where pretense and evasion were no longer viable options. He looked at Vincent's security team, then back at Simone, his expression shifting from defensive suspicion to something that might have been relief at finally having someone to tell about work he'd been forced to perform against his professional judgment and personal conscience. "You bought this whole mess, lady," Rodriguez said, wiping his hands on a rag that had absorbed so much grease and hydraulic fluid that it had become a permanent record of his mechanical work, his voice carrying a mixture of sympathy and incredulity as he processed the implications of someone willingly acquiring responsibility for the systematic destruction he'd been documenting for months. "Then you must have a death wish, because what's been happening to these aircraft isn't maintenance. It's preparation for activities that are going to get people killed. Show me what you've discovered." Simone commanded, her voice carrying the kind of focused urgency that suggested she understood they were operating on borrowed time before whoever was behind Project Icarus realized their operation had been compromised and took steps to eliminate evidence or witnesses who could testify about the systematic modification of commercial aircraft for criminal purposes. Rodriguez hesitated for a moment, looking around the hangar as if he expected hostile surveillance or hidden observers who might be monitoring his conversation with people who weren't supposed to have access to the information he was about to reveal, then gestured for them to follow him up the metal scaffolding that provided access to the aircraft's wing and internal systems. "Come up here where you can see what they've been forcing us to do," he said, his voice heavy with the resignation that comes from months of complicity in activities that violated everything he'd learned about aircraft safety during decades of legitimate maintenance work. Simone climbed the metal scaffolding with sure movements that suggested she was comfortable with industrial environments and hands-on investigation, while Vincent positioned himself to maintain sight lines that would allow him to respond to potential threats, while his team secured the hangar's access points and monitored communication frequencies for any indication that their presence had been detected by hostile parties who might be tracking the facility through electronic surveillance methods. Rodriguez pointed to an open access panel near the fuselage with the kind of professional precision that suggested he'd been documenting these modifications for his own protection, preparing evidence that might be useful if he ever needed to testify about work he'd been forced to perform under threat of employment termination, or worse consequences that had never been explicitly stated, but had been clearly implied through the behavior of supervisors who seemed to have connections to people outside the normal corporate hierarchy. "Derek told us to ignore the weight discrepancies that kept showing up in our computer systems," Rodriguez explained, directing a flashlight beam into the aircraft's internal structure to reveal modifications that were clearly visible to anyone with technical training, but would be invisible to passengers or flight crews who weren't looking for signs of systematic alteration. He claimed it was just sensor error from old equipment that needed recalibration, but look at what's actually been installed inside the wing structure. Simone peered into the access panel with the focused attention of someone who'd learned to recognize evidence of systematic deception through years of investigating corporate fraud and international criminal conspiracies that used legitimate businesses as cover for illegal activities. What she saw inside the wing made her breath catch in her throat as she realized the implications of modifications that had nothing to do with passenger safety or operational efficiency, and everything to do with concealing cargo that wasn't supposed to exist according to any official documentation. The fuel lines had been systematically rerouted from their original configuration, diverted around a secondary tank that had been welded into the wing frame with professional precision that suggested extensive engineering knowledge and access to specialized equipment that wouldn't normally be available for unauthorized aircraft modifications. The hidden tank wasn't included in any blueprints, or maintenance documentation wasn't visible from external inspection, and was designed to appear as normal fuel storage to anyone who didn't know exactly what to look for during detailed technical examination. "It's a smuggling compartment," Rodriguez whispered, his voice carrying the kind of fear that comes from understanding the criminal implications of work you've been forced to participate in without fully comprehending the scope or purpose of the illegal operation. They're not just flying passengers from point A to point B. They're transporting something heavy and valuable in concealed cargo spaces that don't officially exist according to federal aviation records or international customs documentation. Too heavy for narcotics. Rodriguez continued his professional assessment based on weight calculations and structural stress analysis that had been keeping him awake at night as he realized the implications of modifications that were systematically compromising aircraft safety. My best guess based on the structural reinforcement and weight distribution is either gold bullion or high-grade weapons components that need to be transported without appearing on any official cargo manifests or customs declarations. The modification process works like this. Rodriguez explained, his voice gaining confidence as he shared information that had been eating at his conscience for months. They modify the aircraft here during routine maintenance periods, fly them to destinations in countries without extradition, treaties with the United States, empty the concealed cargo compartments during overnight layovers that don't appear suspicious to airport authorities, then return the aircraft to normal passenger service with no visible evidence of the illegal transportation that occurred during the flight. Suddenly, the massive overhead lighting system that illuminated the hangar slammed off with the kind of dramatic finality that suggested someone with access to electrical control systems had made a deliberate decision to plunge the facility into total darkness, creating an environment where Vincent's security team would be operating at a severe tactical disadvantage against anyone who knew the facility layout and had night vision equipment or other specialized tools for operations in low-light conditions. "Secure the principal." Vincent roared, his voice cutting through the darkness with the kind of trained authority that comes from military experience in hostile environments, while flashlight beams began cutting through the blackness as his security personnel moved into protective formations that had been drilled and rehearsed for exactly this kind of situation where technological advantages could be neutralized through superior training and coordination. The heavy metal doors that provided access to the hangar began groaning with mechanical strain as electric motors engaged to seal the facility, creating an acoustic signature that suggested they were being systematically locked inside by someone with administrative access to building security systems that were designed to prevent unauthorized entry, but could just as easily be used to prevent authorized exit when controlled by hostile parties with superior technical resources. They cut the power and sealed the exits. Rodriguez shouted, his voice carrying the panic that comes from realizing you're trapped in an enclosed space with people who have demonstrated their willingness to commit federal crimes to protect their illegal operation. Whoever's been running Project Icarus knows you're here and has decided to eliminate witnesses rather than risk exposure of an operation that probably involves hundreds of millions of dollars and multiple international criminal organizations. From the shadows of the far corner of the hangar, where the darkness was deepest and most concealing, came the sound of slow, deliberate applause that echoed off the metal walls with mocking appreciation for a performance that had apparently been anticipated and prepared for by people who'd been monitoring the situation from the beginning. Clap, clap, clap. The sound was measured and theatrical, designed to demonstrate confidence and control rather than genuine appreciation. Very impressive. Miss Reynolds came, a smooth, cultured voice that emerged from the darkness with the kind of educated authority that suggested expensive private education and extensive experience managing complex operations that required coordination between multiple parties with different areas of expertise. You managed to figure out the basic structure of our operation in under an hour, which is remarkably efficient investigation, considering that it took the Federal Aviation Administration over 10 years to detect the systematic modification of commercial aircraft, and they still don't understand the scope or purpose of what we've accomplished. A spotlight clicked on from the upper catwalk that ran along the hangar's ceiling, creating a blinding beam of light that illuminated Simone while making it impossible for her to see who was controlling the light or how many people might be positioned in the shadows beyond its reach. Standing on the metal grating above them was a man in a pristine gray suit who carried himself with the kind of confident authority that comes from years of successful criminal enterprise conducted behind the facade of legitimate business operations. Simone squinted against the harsh glare, but recognized the man immediately from the extensive background research she'd conducted on all companies that provided services to Skybridge Airlines Research, that had revealed concerning patterns of corporate relationships and financial transactions that didn't match normal business activities. This was Ethan Cross, officially the CEO of Cross Logistics, the third-party contractor that handled catering services and cargo loading operations for Skybridge Airlines, but apparently much more involved in the company's operations than any legitimate service provider should have been. Ethan Cross. Simone said, her voice projecting clearly despite the acoustic challenges of the enclosed space and the psychological pressure of being trapped and outnumbered by people who demonstrated their willingness to commit federal crimes. So you're the architect behind Project Icarus. Derek Hoffman was just the loud racist puppet you used to distract attention from the real criminal enterprise you were operating behind the scenes. Derek Hoffman was extraordinarily useful for our purposes, Ethan Cross replied, descending the metal stairs with the careful precision of someone who was confident in his tactical superiority, but experienced enough to maintain professional caution when dealing with opponents who'd already demonstrated unexpected resourcefulness, flanked by 4 men carrying military-grade submachine guns with the kind of professional bearing that suggested extensive training and operations that never appeared on any official employment records or corporate organizational charts. Derek created exactly the kind of chaos and distraction we needed to operate without scrutiny. Ethan continued, his voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who was finally able to explain the elegant design of a criminal operation that had been years in development and execution while everyone was focused on the racist regional manager who was shouting at customers and creating social media controversies. Absolutely nobody was paying attention to the cargo loading operations that were moving an average of 3 tons of gold bullion every month through concealed compartments that don't exist according to any federal aviation documentation. Ethan stopped approximately 10 feet away from Simone, close enough for conversation, but far enough to maintain tactical advantage while his armed personnel maintained positions that created multiple angles of fire that would be difficult for Vincent's security team to neutralize simultaneously, even with their superior training and coordination. It was a professional standoff that suggested both sides understood the rules of engagement for situations where negotiations might be possible, but violence was an immediately available option if talks failed to produce acceptable outcomes. You have a choice to make. Miss Reynolds? Ethan set his tone, shifting into the kind of businesslike presentation that suggested he'd conducted similar negotiations before and understood the psychological pressure points that made people accept deals they would have rejected under normal circumstances. You can walk away from this situation with your life and your fortune intact by signing over ownership of Skybridge Airlines to my holding company for the nominal consideration of $1, allowing us to continue our operations while you return to your humanitarian projects and international philanthropy without any interference from people who solve problems through methods that don't appear in business school textbooks. And if I refuse your generous offer? Simone asked, her voice carrying the kind of calm curiosity that suggested she was analyzing the tactical situation, rather than experiencing the fear that Ethan was obviously trying to create through his demonstration of superior numbers and firepower. Her mind already working through contingency plans that she'd developed for exactly this kind of situation where negotiations became hostile and violence became a realistic possibility. Then you experience a tragic industrial accident, Ethan replied with a shrug that suggested he considered violence an unfortunate but acceptable business expense when dealing with people who couldn't be persuaded through financial incentives or professional intimidation. A new corporate owner crushed by falling aircraft engine components while conducting a safety inspection of maintenance facilities. These kinds of workplace accidents happen all the time in industrial environments where proper safety protocols aren't followed, and the media narrative writes itself without requiring any creative explanation or complex cover-up operations. Simone didn't flinch or step backward or show any of the physical signs of intimidation that Ethan was obviously expecting to see because she'd spent decades dealing with international criminals and hostile government officials and corporate competitors who'd tried to eliminate her through methods that ranged from financial warfare to physical threats. And she'd learned that the most effective response to intimidation was the kind of calm confidence that suggested superior preparation rather than superior firepower. Instead, she began to laugh. It was a low, genuine sound of amusement that confused everyone in the hangar because it suggested she found something entertaining about a situation where most people would be experiencing terror and desperation. The kind of laughter that indicated knowledge of information that other people didn't possess, and confidence in resources that weren't immediately visible to hostile observers. "Why are you laughing?" Ethan snapped his composure, cracking slightly as he realized that his carefully orchestrated demonstration of power wasn't having its intended psychological effect, his voice rising with the irritation that criminals experience when their victims refuse to behave according to established patterns that make intimidation tactics predictable and effective. "I have armed professionals who are prepared to eliminate you and your security team if you refuse to cooperate with reasonable business proposals." "I'm laughing because you think you're the one in control of this situation," Simone replied, checking her watch with the casual gesture of someone who was operating according to a schedule that other people didn't understand. Her voice carrying the confidence that comes from having contingency plans, for contingencies that most people would never think to prepare for. "You think I came to this hangar just to examine fuel tanks and interview mechanics about aircraft modifications. I came here to bait a trap, Ethan, and you've walked directly into it, with the kind of predictable arrogance that makes criminals easy to catch when they believe they're smarter than law enforcement." Ethan frowned with the expression of someone who was beginning to suspect that information he'd considered reliable might be incomplete or deliberately misleading his eyes scanning the hangar for signs of surveillance or backup that he might have missed during his tactical assessment of the situation. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice carrying the edge that develops when people realize their assumptions about tactical superiority might be based on incomplete intelligence about their opponent's capabilities and resources. Simone reached into her pocket with deliberate slowness that allowed everyone to see that she wasn't reaching for a weapon, and Ethan's guards tensed visibly as they prepared to respond to any threat while maintaining their positions that created overlapping fields of fire. But instead of producing a gun or communication device, she pulled out a small circular object that looked like a sophisticated remote control with multiple function buttons and a small display screen that showed real-time data about electronic systems that most people wouldn't recognize. "Look up," Simone said, her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone who was about to reveal the culmination of planning that had anticipated this exact scenario and prepared responses that would neutralize superior numbers through superior technology and strategic thinking. High in the rafters of the hangar, barely visible in the shadows that concealed the building's structural framework, 3 tiny red lights blinked with the steady rhythm that indicated active electronic surveillance and recording equipment positioned to provide comprehensive coverage of everything that was happening below. Equipment that had been observing and documenting the entire confrontation from angles that would provide clear identification of faces, weapons, and criminal statements that could be used as evidence in federal prosecutions. "I'm a technology billionaire," Ethan Simone said, her voice carrying the kind of cold satisfaction that comes from revealing superior preparation to people who'd underestimated the resources and capabilities they were challenging. "Do you really think I go anywhere without comprehensive surveillance and tactical support that most people can't even imagine? My security team isn't just Vincent and his ground personnel. It's a fully integrated technology platform that includes aerial surveillance, electronic countermeasures, and real-time communication with law enforcement agencies that specialize in dealing with exactly this kind of criminal operation." A low hum filled the air as 3 military-grade micro-drones descended from the ceiling with the smooth precision that indicated remote control by operators with extensive training in tactical deployment of surveillance and defensive systems. Hovering in a triangle formation around Ethan and his armed personnel, with the kind of positioning that suggested they were equipped with weapon systems that could neutralize multiple targets simultaneously if negotiations failed to produce peaceful resolution. "Shoot them down." Ethan yelled, his professional composure finally cracking completely as he realized that his tactical superiority had been systematically neutralized by technology he hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter with conventional weapons, his voice rising to a scream that echoed off the hangar walls and demonstrated the kind of panic that occurs when criminals realize they've been outmaneuvered by superior planning and resources. "I wouldn't recommend that course of action," Simone warned, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what would happen if Ethan's people opened fire on equipment that was designed to respond to hostile actions with overwhelming technological force. Those are military-grade tactical drones equipped with high-voltage taser systems and flashbang payloads that can incapacitate multiple targets simultaneously, but more importantly for your immediate situation. They're currently broadcasting live video feeds to every digital display in JFK Terminal 4 and to my personal YouTube channel, which has over 12 million subscribers who are watching this hostage situation unfold in real time. Ethan's face went white as he pulled out his phone and saw the notification that confirmed his worst fears about the scope of surveillance and documentation that was recording his criminal statements and threats for an audience that included not just law enforcement agencies, but millions of people who would serve as witnesses to crimes that could no longer be denied or covered up through legal maneuvering or corporate influence. You recorded everything." Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible, as he realized that his careful criminal operation had been systematically documented by people with resources he'd never anticipated, and broadcast to an audience that would make it impossible to claim the confrontation had never happened or had been misrepresented through selective editing or false testimony. "I'm broadcasting it live," Simone corrected, her voice carrying the finality of someone who'd just activated systems that couldn't be recalled or negotiated with. "Right now, thousands of passengers in this terminal are watching you threaten to murder me while admitting to systematic aircraft modification for gold smuggling operations. And the FBI isn't just on their way to this location. They're already breaching the perimeter security and preparing to take you into custody for federal crimes that carry mandatory minimum sentences that will keep you in prison until you're too old to remember why you thought criminal enterprise was more profitable than legitimate business operations." As if summoned by Simone's words, the sound of sirens began wailing outside the hangar with the increasing intensity that indicated multiple law enforcement agencies converging on the facility from different directions, their emergency lights creating strobing patterns that were visible through the gaps in the hangar doors despite the storm that was still battering the airport with relentless sheets of rain. The sound cut through the tension like a blade, transforming Ethan's confident criminal enterprise into a desperate situation where escape was no longer possible and negotiations were no longer relevant to the outcome. "Kill her now," Ethan screamed, his voice cracking with the kind of panic that occurs when people realize their carefully constructed criminal operations are collapsing faster than they can process the implications for their freedom and their future. "Kill her before the police breach the facility and take us all into custody." One of his gunmen raised his weapon toward Simone with the mechanical precision that suggested military training and extensive experience with violent solutions to complex problems. But before he could fire, one of the hovering drones released a taser projectile with pinpoint accuracy that struck him center mass and delivered 50,000 volts of electrical disruption that dropped him to the concrete floor in convulsions, his weapon clattering away into the darkness while his body spasmed with involuntary muscle contractions. "Drop your weapons immediately," Vincent shouted, drawing his sidearm with the fluid motion that comes from decades of training in hostile environments, while his security team moved with coordinated precision to disarm the remaining guards who were too distracted by the drone demonstration to maintain effective tactical positioning or respond to multiple threats simultaneously. "Vincent let Ethan run," Simone said calmly, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who understood that some enemies were more valuable as examples than as prisoners, especially when they were about to discover that their escape routes had been systematically eliminated by people with superior planning and resources. "He has nowhere to go except directly into federal custody, and I want him to understand that running will only make his situation worse." Ethan turned and sprinted toward the metal stairs that led to the catwalk, scrambling up the steps with the desperate energy of someone who believed that reaching higher ground might somehow improve his tactical situation or provide access to escape routes that his ground-level perspective had missed. He reached the top of the catwalk, breathing hard, and kicked open the emergency exit door that led to the hangar roof, expecting to find a ladder or service access that would allow him to reach ground level and disappear into the maze of airport service roads and maintenance facilities. Instead, he burst out into the storm and ran directly into a wall of wind and sound that was created by a police helicopter hovering exactly 20 feet above the hangar roof, its spotlight creating a cone of brilliant illumination that turned Ethan into a clearly defined target against the dark metal surface of the building. The helicopter's downdraft was so intense that he could barely stand upright, and the spotlight was so bright that he couldn't see anything beyond its glare, effectively trapping him in a circle of light that eliminated any possibility of concealment or escape. "This is the FBI came." A voice from the helicopter's loudspeaker system, the words carrying clearly, despite the noise of the rotors and the storm, "Ethan Cross, you are surrounded and have no escape routes available. Get on the ground immediately and place your hands behind your head, or we will deploy additional tactical measures to ensure your compliance with federal arrest procedures." Ethan looked around the rooftop, desperately searching for any option that might allow him to avoid the inevitable consequences of years of criminal activity that had finally caught up with him in the form of overwhelming law enforcement response that he had no resources to counter or evade. Finding nothing but empty roof space and the spotlight that pinned him like an insect under a microscope, he slumped to his knees in the pouring rain and dropped his cane, raising his hands in the universal gesture of surrender that marked the end of his criminal career and the beginning of a federal prosecution that would ensure he never operated an illegal enterprise again. Inside the hangar, Simone watched the conclusion of the operation on her phone, cycling through multiple camera angles that provided comprehensive documentation of Ethan's surrender and the systematic arrest of his armed personnel by FBI tactical teams that had been coordinating with her security operation from the beginning. She swiped her finger across the screen to end the live stream that had broadcast the entire confrontation to millions of viewers, then turned to Rodriguez, the mechanic, who was still cowering behind a tool chest, like someone who expected additional violence despite the obvious conclusion of the criminal enterprise he'd been forced to support. "Rodriguez," she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of professional courtesy that suggested she understood the difference between willing participation in criminal activity and coerced cooperation with people who had the power to destroy careers and lives. "How long would it take to strip those illegal cargo compartments out of the entire Skybridge fleet and restore the aircraft to their original safety specifications?" Rodriguez emerged from his hiding place, slowly, his expression showing the kind of cautious hope that people display when they believe they might be offered legitimate employment after months of being forced to participate in activities that violated their professional ethics and personal values. "With a proper crew and unlimited budget for parts and labor," he said, scratching his chin as he performed mental calculations about the scope of work required to undo months of systematic aircraft modification, maybe 3 weeks per aircraft. "If we work around the clock shifts and bring in additional certified mechanics who understand the technical specifications for these kinds of restoration projects." "You have unlimited budget," Simone replied, her voice carrying the authority of someone who could authorize expenditures that most people couldn't imagine and you're now the head of maintenance operations for the entire fleet with full authority to hire whoever you need and purchase whatever equipment and parts are required to ensure that every aircraft meets or exceeds all federal safety standards. Rodriguez's jaw dropped as he processed the implications of being offered not just employment, but leadership responsibility for legitimate maintenance operations that would restore his professional dignity and allow him to use his technical expertise for passenger safety rather than criminal enterprise. "You're serious about this?" he asked, his voice carrying the disbelief that comes when people are offered opportunities that seemed impossible just minutes earlier. "You want me to run the entire maintenance department and make these planes safe for the people who trust their lives to our technical competence?" "Dead serious." Simone confirmed, her voice carrying the finality of decisions that would reshape the entire culture of an organization that had been systematically corrupted by people who valued short-term profits over long-term sustainability and human dignity. "I want this fleet restored to perfect safety standards, and I want every employee to understand that their work matters and their expertise is valued by management that actually understands the difference between legitimate business operations and criminal enterprise disguised as cost-cutting efficiency." As she turned and walked toward the hangar doors that were being pried open by FBI entry teams equipped with the tools and authority to process crime scenes and collect evidence that would support prosecutions of everyone involved in Project Icarus, Vincent fell into step beside her with the protective positioning that had become automatic after years of working together in environments where professional success often attracted hostile attention from people who preferred illegal solutions to competitive challenges. That was extremely risky. "Miss Reynolds," Vincent said, his voice carrying the professional concern that bodyguards develop when their principals deliberately expose themselves to danger in order to achieve objectives that could potentially be accomplished through safer methods, using yourself as bait for a criminal organization that had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their operation. "High risk, high reward," Vincent Simone replied, adjusting her hoodie as they stepped out into the chaos of police cars and federal agents who were systematically processing the largest aviation crime scene in recent memory. Her voice carrying the satisfaction of someone whose strategic planning had achieved objectives that would have been impossible through conventional law enforcement investigation. Derek Hoffman was just the symptom of institutional dysfunction, but Ethan Cross was the disease itself. The criminal enterprise that was systematically destroying this company from within, while using legitimate business operations as cover for international smuggling that put passengers' lives at risk every time they flew on aircraft that had been modified for illegal purposes. "What happens now?" Vincent asked as they approached their vehicle, which was surrounded by the organized chaos of federal agents who were coordinating the largest aviation crime bust in recent history, with evidence teams and forensic specialists who would spend weeks documenting every aspect of the criminal operation that had been systematically corrupting Skybridge Airlines for years. Simone looked back at the terminal in the distance where she could see the faces of passengers pressed against the windows, watching the arrest of Ethan Cross on the hangar roof, and probably wondering what kind of corporate drama they were witnessing through the rain-streaked glass. Now, she said, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just eliminated a threat that could have eventually killed hundreds of innocent people. "I have a flight to catch, and I believe I'm scheduled for a meeting in the Prestige Lounge where absolutely no one will tell me to wait outside." 6 months after the night that destroyed his career and transformed him from regional director to dishwasher, Derek Hoffman stood in the service alley behind Sal's diner holding a crumpled copy of the New York Post that featured a front-page photograph of a sleek aircraft painted in midnight blue and gold, with a headline that proclaimed Phoenix Rising Reynolds, Global Unveils Revolutionary Sky Suite Program. The newspaper's rain-soaked pages contained a detailed article about the incredible transformation of what had once been Skybridge Airlines into the most respected and profitable carrier in North America, with record customer satisfaction scores and industry-leading employee retention rates. Derek's hands shook as he read about the technological innovations and customer service improvements that had made Phoenix Air the gold standard for commercial aviation, about the employee profit-sharing programs and comprehensive training initiatives that had created a corporate culture where every worker was valued and respected regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. The article mentioned Simone Reynolds' vision of aviation as public service rather than extractive industry, her commitment to treating passengers as honored guests, rather than revenue sources to be maximized through systematic degradation of service and dignity. The newspaper article also mentioned a special gala being held that evening to celebrate the 6-month anniversary of the acquisition that had saved thousands of jobs and transformed an industry, a celebration taking place at an upscale event space in Queens called the Sapphire Room, where Phoenix Air executives and employees would gather to acknowledge the remarkable turnaround that had become a business school case study in ethical corporate leadership and employee empowerment. Derek looked up from the newspaper and realized with growing horror that the Sapphire Room was located exactly 3 blocks away from the diner, where he now spent 14 hours a day scrubbing dishes for $12 an hour, washing away the grease and food waste that accumulated in the kind of establishment that served the working-class customers he'd once dismissed as beneath his attention when he'd wielded the power to determine who deserved respect and who deserved humiliation. Derek came, Sal's gravelly voice from the kitchen door. "Who are you talking to out there?" "We got a private party tonight. Some corporate celebration that rented the whole overflow dining room, and I need every dish spotless and every surface sanitized because these people are paying premium prices and expecting premium service." Derek felt his blood drain from his face as he realized that Phoenix Air personnel would be dining in the same building where he was now employed, as the lowest-ranking member of the kitchen staff, that the people whose careers he'd once thought he controlled would be eating meals prepared in the kitchen where he now scraped food waste from plates and tried to make himself invisible to avoid the kind of recognition that would complete his humiliation by forcing him to acknowledge how far he'd fallen from his former position of authority. "Sal." Derek said, his voice cracking with the strain of 6 months of manual labor and social isolation. "I can't work tonight. I'm sick. I need to go home and rest so I don't contaminate the food service with whatever illness I might be developing." "You leave tonight, you don't come back tomorrow or any other day," Sal replied with the cold finality that employers use when they're dealing with workers who are completely replaceable and have no negotiating power. "I need bodies in that kitchen, and if you walk out on a shift when I'm depending on you to handle the increased volume, you're finished here permanently. Find another job if this one doesn't meet your professional standards." Derek looked at the newspaper photograph of the gleaming Phoenix Air aircraft, then at the rain-soaked alley where he stood in his grease-stained apron, and realized that he had no choice but to remain in the kitchen, where he might encounter people who remembered when he'd had the power to humiliate them, and now would see him in circumstances that represented the complete reversal of their positions in the social hierarchy. He folded the newspaper and walked back into the kitchen, hoping that he could somehow remain invisible during the evening that would test whether his humiliation was complete or if there were still lower depths of degradation waiting to be explored. The evening was a continuous nightmare of anxiety as Derek tried to anticipate every moment when someone from his former professional life might walk through the kitchen doors and recognize the man who'd once wielded authority over their employment and customer service experiences. He kept his head down, scrubbing dishes with the mechanical intensity of someone who was trying to disappear into the repetitive motions of manual labor, listening to the sounds of laughter and conversation from the dining room where people were celebrating the kind of professional success he'd once taken for granted. Around 9 o'clock, the kitchen doors swung open to admit a woman in an elegant navy pantsuit who moved with the confident bearing of someone who'd earned her authority through competence rather than inheriting it through organizational politics or demographic advantages. She was holding an empty water glass and looking for ice to refresh her drink during what was obviously a break from the celebration that was taking place in the private dining room. Derek recognized the voice before he saw the face clearly, and his entire body froze as he realized that Angela Martinez, the gate agent who'd once deferred to his authority and implemented his discriminatory policies, was now standing in the kitchen wearing the kind of professional attire that suggested significant career advancement and personal growth. Her name tag identified her as Director of Customer Experience, a position that represented exactly the kind of promotion Derek had once assumed would be his reward for years of loyal service to corporate interests that prioritized short-term profits over long-term sustainability. "Excuse me," Angela said to the line cook, her voice carrying the polite professionalism that suggested she'd learned to treat all workers with respect regardless of their position in the organizational hierarchy. "Could I get some ice for this water glass? The bar service is overwhelmed with demand, and I don't want to interrupt the celebration by making people wait for basic refreshments." Angela's transformation was remarkable in its completeness. She stood straight with genuine confidence rather than the artificial authority she'd once derived from her power to deny service to customers who didn't meet her visual criteria for importance. Her hair was professionally styled, her makeup was subtle and appropriate, and she wore her position of responsibility like someone who understood that authority was a tool for serving others rather than a weapon for asserting dominance over people who couldn't fight back. The line cook was happy to help her with the ice, and Angela was chatting politely about the success of the evening's celebration when her eyes swept across the kitchen and landed on the dishwashing station where Derek was trying to make himself invisible behind a cloud of steam from the industrial cleaning equipment. She stopped mid-sentence, her expression shifting from professional pleasantness to shocked recognition as her brain processed the implications of seeing someone she'd once considered a powerful authority figure reduced to the most menial position in a service industry kitchen. "Derek," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the kitchen noise, but carrying enough uncertainty to suggest she couldn't quite believe what her eyes were telling her about the dramatic reversal of circumstances that had occurred since their last professional interaction 6 months earlier. Derek slowly turned around, unable to avoid the confrontation any longer, holding a dirty dish towel in his hands that were now permanently stained with grease and marked by the kind of physical labor he'd once assumed was performed by people who lacked the intelligence or ambition to achieve the white-collar success he'd considered his natural right based on his education and demographic advantages. "Hello, Angela," he said, his voice barely above a whisper as he tried to process the emotional complexity of being recognized by someone who now occupied the kind of position he'd once held someone who'd transformed herself from a customer service representative into a corporate executive while he'd fallen from management to manual labor. Angela stared at him with an expression that wasn't mockery or celebration of his downfall, but something much worse for Derek's psychological well-being. Genuine pity mixed with professional sympathy for someone who'd obviously experienced catastrophic personal and professional failure. Her face showed the kind of compassionate concern that suggested she understood how devastating his fall had been, but also reflected the reality that his current situation was the direct result of choices he'd made about how to treat other human beings when he'd believed his actions would never be subject to consequences or accountability. "I heard you were having difficulties," Angela said softly, her voice carrying the careful tone that people use when they're trying to acknowledge someone's pain without making them feel worse about circumstances that everyone understands are the result of their own poor decisions and character flaws. "But I had no idea things had become this challenging for you." Derek wanted to scream, wanted to throw the dirty plates against the wall and storm out of the kitchen with whatever dignity he could salvage from a situation that represented the complete inversion of every assumption he'd ever made about social hierarchy and professional authority. But he looked at his blistered hands and remembered his overdue rent and realized that even this humiliation was better than homelessness and complete destitution. "I'm just between opportunities," Derek said, his voice trembling with a mixture of shame and barely controlled rage as he tried to maintain some pretense that his current situation was temporary rather than the logical consequence of years of treating other people as disposable obstacles to his comfort and advancement, helping out a friend, while I explore new career directions that might be more suitable for my long-term professional development goals," Derek Angela said gently, her voice carrying the kind of patient correction that supervisors use when they're trying to help employees face reality without destroying their remaining self-respect. "You're washing dishes in a commercial kitchen. That's honest work that deserves respect, but it's not a temporary consulting position or a career transition strategy." Before Derek could formulate a response that might preserve some fragment of his dignity, the kitchen doors swung open again to admit Simone Reynolds herself, moving through the space, with the natural authority of someone who commanded respect through competence, rather than demanding it through position or intimidation. She was wearing a stunning gold gown that seemed to capture and reflect light from every surface, creating an almost ethereal presence that made everyone in the kitchen briefly stop their work to acknowledge her obvious importance and success. Simone looked radiant in a way that had nothing to do with her expensive clothing or professional makeup, radiating the kind of genuine satisfaction that comes from knowing you've used your power and resources to make other people's lives better, rather than worse. She moved through the kitchen with the easy confidence of someone who was comfortable in any environment, because she treated every person she encountered with the same fundamental respect and professional courtesy. "Angela is everything. Proceeding smoothly out there?" Simone asked, her voice carrying the warm professionalism that had become the signature of Phoenix Air's corporate culture, where every employee from mechanics to executives understood that their work contributed to something larger than profit maximization. They were providing safe, dignified transportation that respected the humanity of every person who trusted their lives to the company's competence and integrity. Angela started to respond about the evening's success, but her words trailed off as she noticed Simone's gaze shifting to the dishwashing station where Derek was standing with the frozen expression of someone who realized that his most humiliating moment was about to become even more devastating through the presence of the one person whose opinion of him mattered most in the context of his spectacular professional downfall. For a long moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Simone looked at Derek without any visible surprise or shock, her expression showing the clinical assessment of someone who was observing the natural consequences of choices that had been made freely and with full knowledge of their potential implications. She didn't look angry or vindictive or pleased by his obvious suffering. She looked at him with the same professional detachment she might use when reviewing quarterly financial reports or evaluating operational efficiency metrics. "Derek," Simone said finally, her voice carrying neither warmth nor coldness, but the kind of neutral acknowledgement that suggested she was simply noting his presence without any emotional investment in his current circumstances or future prospects. "Ms. Reynolds." Derek whispered, his voice barely audible as he realized that the woman whose dignity he'd tried to destroy now held the power to complete his humiliation, or possibly offer him some path toward redemption, though he suspected that his choices had eliminated any possibility of mercy or second chances. The kitchen fell silent except for the hissing of steam and the mechanical hum of industrial refrigeration, creating an acoustic backdrop that seemed to emphasize the dramatic reversal of power and circumstances that was being played out in a service industry workspace, where the concepts of respect and authority were being redefined through the simple act of two people acknowledging each other's existence and the journey that had brought them to this moment of reckoning. Derek's story serves as a brutal reminder that the wheel of fortune is always turning, and those who abuse their power often find themselves crushed beneath the very mechanisms they once used to oppress others. He made the fatal mistake of confusing net worth with self-worth, believing that a person's value could be determined by their appearance rather than their character. That authority meant the right to humiliate rather than the responsibility to serve. Simone Reynolds didn't just fire a corrupt manager. She dismantled a culture of institutional cruelty and replaced it with something unprecedented in commercial aviation, a company that treated every employee and every passenger with the same fundamental dignity and respect. She proved that the true measure of leadership isn't the price of your accessories or the size of your office, but the value you place on the humanity of everyone whose lives are affected by your decisions. While Derek scrubs dishes in the shadows of the empire he once served, he remains a living warning to anyone who believes that power is permanent and consequences are for other people. Be careful who you step on while climbing the ladder of success, because you never know who you'll have to face when that ladder collapses beneath the weight of your own moral failures.